When a problem arises, people turn to scientists for answers. The University of Washington 2006 Science Forum features faculty sharing research results on the world's most vexing problems. Mary Desis examines how the immune system may be used in the future to prevent cancer through the development of vaccines. David Eaton looks at the research on genetic, lifestyle, dietary, and environmental factors to puzzle out why some of us get cancer and others don't. Garrett Odell examines the use of mathematical models to shed light on how biological gene networks operate and how these models reveal the networks to be astonishingly robust, despite their unintelligent design. Buddy Ratner updates us on the progress of regenerative medicine and addresses the practical and ethical issues surrounding tissue regrowth and organ replacement. And Ray Hilborn provides facts to dispel the fears of a worldwide fisheries crisis and discusses the changing objectives of fisheries management. Join us in Puzzling Out the Science. Exploring Our World, Puzzling Out the Science is made possible by the University of Washington Alumni Association, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Office of Research, the College of Engineering, the School of Medicine, the College of Ocean and Fisheries Sciences, and the School of Public Health and Community Medicine. Additional funding for this program is provided by the University Bookstore and UW Medicine.
Good evening, and welcome to the 2006 UW Science Forum. I'm Dave Kalman. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences at the U. Our department, Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences, concerns itself with a broad range of issues and environmental factors that contribute to wellness or disease in humans. Drawing upon medical, biological, and natural sciences, as well as aspects of engineering, we seek to identify and understand these factors and how they may be managed by our society. Our department's origins go back to the late 1940s as a laboratory program, part of the Preventive Medicine Division of the medical school. With the creation of the School of Public Health and Community Medicine in 1970, our department was formed, and today we have multiple academic programs offering undergraduate and graduate training in fields such as occupational medicine, toxicology, and environmental or occupational protection. The research activity in our department is also wide-ranging, from studies of molecular and cellular responses to toxic agents, to management of pervasive workplace or community hazards, such as noise, air pollution, and biological hazards. We provide consultative services to several state agencies, as well as to employers, labor groups, and professionals involved in health protection. Our former students play critical roles in developing policy, assuring environmental and workplace practices, and in developing new knowledge in these areas. Our speaker tonight is a very distinguished member of our faculty, Professor David Eaton. He has spent virtually all of his professional career as UW faculty, along the way serving as director for the toxicology program in our department from 1983 to 1990, then as associate chairman from 1990 to 92, as associate dean for research in our school from 2000 to 2005, and is currently associate vice provost for research for the entire university. He has made noteworthy contributions in several areas, including his efforts to develop and disseminate materials for introducing environmental health science concepts into K-12 curricula, and has served in prominent positions in national professional societies and for the National Academies of Science. Among his other accomplishments, he founded and has for the past decade led the UW Center for Ecogenetics and Environmental Health. This center supports the efforts of diverse scientists at UW, Fred Hutchinson, and elsewhere to better understand the interplay of genetic and environmental factors, such as diet or exposures to environmental chemicals, in affecting human health and conferring either protection or susceptibility. In his presentation tonight, he will consider these factors in relation to the specific health outcome of cancer. Please help me welcome Professor Eaton.
Thank you all for coming this evening. I hope you will find what I have to say interesting, and I hope that you develop some questions as we go along this evening, because I'm sure that this topic is something that is familiar to everyone. There isn't a soul in this room whose life has not been touched by cancer in one way or another. So I hope to be able to address this topic in a way that will be of interest to you. I am going to talk about some numbers, some statistics. I'm not a statistician, and I'm not hopefully going to bore you with lots of irrelevant facts and figures. I think probably the best way to start this in talking about statistics is to recall one of Mark Twain's comments that there are lies, there are damned lies, and there are statistics. So you really have to keep in mind that in a field like cancer research, there's a tremendous amount of information and a tremendous amount of studies that are evaluated, and it depends very much on how you look at those data and what really constitutes those data to draw effective conclusions. And there are lots of ways to spin statistics, as you're aware. So I'm going to be addressing a couple of questions first. And it appears, and if you ask somebody, the person sitting next to you, the question, are we an epidemic of cancer? There are a lot of ways of answering that, two simple ways, yes or no. And in fact, there are more people dying today from cancer than ever before. So from that perspective, we may be appropriately said to be in an epidemic of cancer. But we're living longer. And basically, cancer is a disease, by and large, of old age. And I'll come back to that point in just a moment. So the fact that we're living longer means we're not dying from other diseases. And if cancer is more common in older disease, then we're going to see more of it and more people dying from it. But cancer is not a single disease. There are many types of cancer, and in fact, each cancer, almost to the individual, is more or less its own unique type of disease. And so we need to look at specific types of cancer, as well as consider the age and the changes of age distribution across the population. We need to consider the differences in mortality versus incidence. Mortality is obvious, cancers from which someone dies. Incidence is simply the frequency at which it occurs. Now, for some kinds of cancer, for example, pancreatic cancer and brain cancers are two tragic, almost always fatal cancers. Some people survive them. It's marvelous when they do. But some types of cancer, the incidence data and the mortality data are not a lot different. Other types of cancer, like basal cell carcinoma, the common type of cancer that one gets from sunlight exposure, is very treatable. Not very many people die of basal cell carcinoma, so the incidence and the mortality statistics are very different. And so when you see people talking about statistics, these are things to ask about in cancer. Well, are you talking about cancer mortality? Are you talking about cancer incidence? Are they age adjusted as to take into account the shift in demographics? And obviously, there are certain types of cancer that are specific to gender. Obviously, prostate cancer is limited to males. You might think that breast cancer is limited to females, but in fact, that's not the case, although being female is by far the largest risk for breast cancer. So if we look at these numbers and we just roll some of the general statistics into one, or boil it down to a couple of numbers, these are kind of alarming statistics. 1 out of 3 people living today, in fact, 1 out of 2 males living today and 1 out of 3 females living today will get or develop some type of cancer in their lifetime. And at the statistics today, about 1 out of 4 will die from cancer. That equates in the U.S. population to approximately, well, in fact, this year, over 500,000 deaths in the United States from cancer. And it's the second leading cause of death in the United States. Now, as I mentioned, cancer is basically a disease of old age, although you all know, I certainly know of children who have developed cancer, died from cancer. There are a few types of relatively rare cancers that you see at somewhat high incidence in children, certain types of leukemias and certain types of brain cancer in particular. So it's not exclusively a disease of old age, and I don't want you to think I'm saying that. Finally, cancer is a disease process, and at the end of this talk, I'll talk a little bit about what we know about how a good cell goes bad, how cancer develops. So getting back to this point of age, going across the rows here are different age groups from 40 to 40 to 49, 50 to 64, and greater than 64. And the numbers below here are simply representing the percent of cancers, of those types of cancer distributed across the age group. And what you'll see is, and these are just data to kind of illustrate the point I was talking about, cancer being largely a disease of old age. Some types of cancer, like prostate, exceedingly rare in men under the age of 50. Breast cancer, on the other hand, predominantly in women over the age of 50, although about 25% or so of breast cancers do occur in women under the age of 50. Lung cancer, largely a disease of people over the age of 50, about 95%. And colorectal cancer, again, largely a disease that you see in people over the age of 50. And as you get above, actually, as you go way up the age curve, it actually starts to go down a little bit, and that may be some genetic factors of some people just having the right genes and seeming to be fairly resistant to developing it. So these numbers just kind of show you a little bit of the idea that if you have a population that's living longer, because they're not dying of something else, then you're going to see more cancers. Now, if we look at the types of cancers, and there are literally hundreds of different specific types of cancer that exist, these show you the major ones, about a dozen or so of the major contributors to cancer mortality in the United States. And not surprising, I don't think it will surprise you anyhow, lung and bronchus cancer tops the list in both males and females. Next is colorectal cancer in males anyhow, and breast cancer in females, but colorectal cancer is about the same incidence in males and females and constitutes about 10% of cancer-related mortality in both males and females. And you can see and go on down the list. And what's amazing about these statistics, if you look at these, the first is how much lung cancer there is in the United States, and you can probably guess why, and I'll show you some data on that in just a moment. But I find one of the amazing aspects of the statistics for this in this bottom row here, and that is that about a quarter of the cancers that happen, that people die from, are what we would consider relatively rare. They account for less than 2 or 3% of all cancers. So there are lots of different kinds of cancer that cause mortality in the United States and throughout the world. Now, within these categories of cancer, and we'll talk in a few moments about what we think we know about the causes of many of these types of cancer, the incidence of some of these cancer, both mortality as well as incidence, are increasing. And for others, they're going down. In the United States, in the last few years, liver cancer, especially in males, and it occurs, if you look on this chart here, you'll see that liver cancer, liver and intrahepatic bile duct cancers account for about 4% of cancer deaths in males. You don't even see it on the female list. It's about 2% in females. It's about twice as common in males as females. And the incidence of that has actually been increasing fairly significantly over the past decade. Likewise, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in both males and females has been increasing, and we're not really sure what the reasons for those increases are. In some instances, there's an increase in incidence, but not an increase in mortality. And a real challenge in the statistics in trying to understand trends in cancer over time, especially with incidence, is some of the changes may be due to better reporting, especially if you look back 20, 30, 40 years. We're doing a better job of capturing those cases that actually occur. And so as you look at trends across time, and we will do so in a moment, some of those changes may in fact not be real, but rather a reflection of a better job of counting the numbers and reporting those cases. There are cancer registries now throughout the United States. We have one, Fred Hutch Cancer Center runs one here that covers the state of Washington and other parts of the Northwest. Excellent cancer centers now that do a really good job of collecting these data, but that was not always the situation. As many of you recall, I think it was President Richard Nixon that started the war on cancer in the 1960s. And if you look at these numbers, you would have to conclude that it's not been a very effective war. We've seen a dramatic reduction in mortality from heart disease in the United States, and a dramatic reduction in cerebrovascular diseases if you compare age-adjusted. And so these numbers now have adjusted for demographic shifts in the population. So they're age-adjusted, and they're adjusted for the change in population. So they're expressed per 100,000 people after adjusting for age based on statistics for the year 2000. You'll see a dramatic reduction in heart disease, dramatic reduction in cardiovascular disease, and reductions in a variety of other types of causes of mortality, such as pneumonia and influenza, and almost no change in the age-adjusted mortality for cancer from 1950 compared to 2003. Now, for some types of cancer, we've made remarkable gains, and they really don't show up very well on this statistic. Leukemias, the treatments now for leukemias and earlier diagnosis are very effective, and the mortality for leukemias, especially childhood leukemias, has improved dramatically. We're seeing increases in better earlier diagnosis and better treatment for breast cancers as well. And the incidence of breast cancer is going up. The mortality from breast cancer is not changing that much, but that's because we're doing a better job hopefully, of diagnosing and treating. So let's look at some of these statistics now. And going back to how I started this, these statistics represent mortality. These are not incidence data. They are age-adjusted, okay? So they've taken into account the shift in demographics. And if you look at the axis here, you'll see that clear over on the far left is 1930. Well, you don't have to use your imagination to recognize that how good we were at collecting statistics in 1930 on these things is probably not like we are today. And so some of the earlier numbers, they're probably adequate. They're certainly better for mortality data than incidence data, but nevertheless, some of the early numbers may be a little shaky in terms of how accurate they are. But there's a couple of remarkable trends now in these data. Okay, the first thing that you notice immediately is you see that big kind of maroon-colored line there. You see this line going up dramatically. This is lung cancer mortality in the United States, age-adjusted. And what's amazing is if you look at this, in 1930, the incidence or the mortality from lung cancer was very low. In fact, it was lower than many other types of cancer. The mortality from stomach cancer was remarkably high. And the mortality for colorectal cancer was about where it is today. It hasn't changed a lot. It's gone up and down a little bit. So for some types of cancer, we've seen large changes in mortality. And for other types of, like leukemias and liver cancer, as you see, they've maintained a relatively level incidence over time. Again, leukemias, you can see a little bit of a downturn. Prostate cancer has also remained relatively common. Now let me, and we're not going to run around with the microphone, but shout it out, okay? I'm going to ask you a question. Why do you think the incidence or the mortality, the rate of cancer mortality of stomach cancer has gone down so dramatically in males from the early 1930s to today? Any ideas? Okay, I've heard a couple of things that you're right on track. Okay, refrigeration and diet. Okay, now the real answer is we don't really know, but the best guess is, okay, refrigeration and diet. Those are the two things that come into thinking. And one of the things about refrigeration is that prior to refrigeration, people did not have available to them fresh fruits and vegetables throughout the year. They were really very seasonal. Prior to refrigeration, people didn't use a lot more preserved foods, especially smoked foods and salt-preserved foods. Now, interestingly, if you look across the world, there are some regions of the world, particularly in Japan, that continue to have a stomach cancer mortality rate very similar to what it was in the United States in the 1930s. It's come down a little bit, but it's very high. Japanese Americans who maintain their genetics but adopt the lifestyle and the cultural habits of where they live, adopt the stomach cancer incidence of where they live, not based on their genetics. So we're pretty sure that the stomach cancer changes are not largely genetically based. Now, just in the last couple of decades, an amazing discovery about the etiology of stomach cancer was made, and that is that probably the majority, perhaps a large majority, of stomach cancers are secondary to a bacterial infection. And when this was first proposed by some scientists in, I believe they were in Australia or New Zealand, that was not well accepted. And it took a lot of persistence on their part to convince, and a lot of good data to convince the world that in fact, many stomach cancers were due to Helicobacter coli. And today, this is a marvelous finding because there are treatments with antibiotics that can actually assist in lowering stomach cancer incidence. But again, it's changed very dramatically. Now these are males. Let's take a look at females. And you'll see a similar trend. Unfortunately, on this slide, I left off the lung cancer label, but it's pretty obvious to you. It's the same color, and it's the one that went up. Okay? So lung cancer incidence in females also went up dramatically, but it didn't start going up as soon as males. It was somewhat later. Stomach cancer, we see the same trend in stomach cancer mortality in females as we saw in males, a dramatic decline from the early 1930s into the 1970s and beyond. And breast cancer, again, as you see, has maintained a fairly stable mortality rate, except in the last 15 or 20 years, we are seeing a decline in that. If you were to look at incidence, you would see an increase in incidence, but a decline in mortality. So we are making grounds. We're doing a better job of diagnosing early and treating breast cancers, and that is now showing up in the statistics if you look across the United States. So now let's go back to that magenta line that's increased and look at a statistic that won't surprise you, I expect. Plotted on that heavy dark line there is the per capita consumption of cigarettes in the United States. And this is both males and females. It's not broken out there. But what you can see is it tracks the mortality from lung cancer in males quite well, with about a 20 or so year lag. And that's exactly what we understand now about most causes of cancer, whether it's exposure to a chemical in the workplace or something in our diet, that there's typically takes a long period of time from when the exposure first started to when the disease actually occurs, what we call a latency period. And that latency period for tobacco smoke is on average around 20 years or so. Now, the data, and it's not shown in this slide, but if you were to split out the male smoking and the female smoking, you could predict, and in fact, if I go back and look at that lung cancer incidence rate, one thing to notice is I think it's 1987 there, you'll see that lung cancer surpassed breast cancer as a leading cause of cancer-related deaths in women. And that was actually predicted 15 years before it happened, based solely on the relationship between per capita consumption of cigarettes and breast cancer. So in the 1970s, scientists were predicting that by 1986 or 1987, lung cancer will surpass breast cancer as the leading cause of cancer-related deaths, unless something dramatic changes in terms of the treatment and diagnosis of either of those diseases. So now I'm going to play a little bit of dice here, and we're going to look at different factors, and we're going to make an estimate. I put on here a guesstimate because, again, these are educated guesses. They're not just my guesses. They're guesses of a number of scientists throughout the world, written review articles, and tried to say, this is what I think the science says. And I've updated them a little bit and taken a little bit of liberty with some of these types of things to give you my own perspectives. But almost, I think without exception, experts in the field of cancer and cancer epidemiology agree that diet is probably the most important, or one of the two most important factors in cancer risk overall. And, well, what is it about diet? It's a very complicated factor, and we'll spend quite a lot of time here following, as I go through this thing, talking about some examples of factors in the diet. And by diet, we mean everything in the diet. We mean the good and the bad. Okay, so there are things in our diet that might cause cancer. There are things in our diet that help us from getting cancer, keep us from getting cancer. So this is weighing out, and it's simply saying this is an important factor. And how you change your diet can change the statistics in terms of the development of many different types of cancer. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Not surprisingly, tobacco shows up number 2 here. Largely lung cancer, but certainly not exclusively lung cancer, as I'm sure you're aware. Tobacco contributes probably on the order of 90 to 95% of lung cancers are thought to be tobacco-related. There are tragic cases, well, they're all tragic cases, but there are cases where people who've never smoked a cigarette in their life develop lung cancer, and we don't know what those causes are. There are some studies that have suggested that radon from indoor air is an important risk factor. Radon generates radioactive materials, and as you breathe these into your lungs, we know from studies of miners who worked in radon mines that they have a higher rate of lung cancer. Some EPA studies have suggested that much of the 5% that you don't attribute to cigarette smoking might in fact be due to indoor exposure to radon gas. And that's highly variable across the country based on geological characteristics. So on this side of the mountains in the Seattle area, we don't have generally a big problem of radon gas. In some areas around Spokane, if people have basements, from the natural radioactive materials in the soils, radon gas can accumulate indoors and may contribute to some cancer risk for lung cancer. But most of tobacco is a major cause not only of lung cancer, but of esophageal cancer, of kidney cancer, and of course of oral cancers as well, and several others. Infectious agents, this used to be way down on the list. In fact, in the 1950s, there was a lot of belief that a lot of cancers were due to infectious agents. And that kind of went by the wayside. And there was a strong focus in the 60s and 70s about chemicals in our environment being causes of cancer. And in recent years, really in the last couple of decades, we've sort of come back around saying, you know, infectious agents are probably fairly important, and there are some really good examples. Cervical cancer, which is a leading cause of cancer-related deaths, especially in developing parts of the world. We do a pretty good job of diagnosing it in the United States and treating it early, due largely to the development of the Pap smear and better earlier detection. But the human papillomavirus probably accounts for 95% plus of cases of cervical cancer. So that is largely a cancer that's related to an infectious agent. There are a variety of other factors that dictate, and not everybody that is infected with HPV will develop cervical cancer. So it's not just by itself a risk factor, but it is a very important one. And there are probably other infectious agents as well. I mentioned Helicobacter as a infectious agent that contributes to stomach cancer risk. HIV/AIDS. The primary cause of death of AIDS patients is immunodeficiency and subsequent problems from that. But one of the problems actually is the development of some types of cancer, in particular Kaposi sarcoma. So there are a number of examples where infectious agents contribute to cancer risk. Now, reproductive sexual behavior, that seems a little bit strange perhaps, that would be as important perhaps as it is. And I'll give you in a moment a specific example of this, but this really has to do largely with reproductive behaviors, the age, for example, that a woman has her first child, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment, affects the rate of breast cancer across the population. For reasons that are not completely clear, women who are sexually active at a young age, the cervical tissue seems to be more susceptible to HPV infection than older women. And so the age, and HPV is sexually transmitted in many instances, so cervical cancer incidence changes in some reflection of sexual activity and sexual behavior. Now, clearly genetics plays a role in all of this. And in fact, the area that I do a lot of my research in is an area that we talk about gene-environment interactions, in which the disease isn't due to genetics, and it's not just due to something in the environment, it's due to an interaction between your genetics and your environment. And that's very important, and that's not really reflected in this 5% statistic here. There are a number of cancers which are largely genetic. You probably, most all of you have heard of the so-called breast cancer genes, Brca1, Brca2. Mary Claire King here at the University of Washington first discovered the important genetic role of Brca1 in breast cancer. This is a genetic factor, and if you have a variant, a genetic variant of Brca1, you are at much, much higher risk of developing breast cancer. When the studies were done initially, it appeared that if you had the Brca1 variant, or one of many variants, that you were perhaps 90% likely to get breast cancer at some time in your life. Now, those studies were biased because they selected families with a strong genetic history of breast cancer, and there were probably other genetic factors laying on top of that particular one. So now it looks like a woman who tests positive for the Brca1 genetic variant maybe has about a 50%, and it depends on the studies, anywhere from 40 to 70, 80% chance of getting breast cancer in their life. Very high, but it's not 100%. And the overall chances of a woman getting breast cancer sometime in her life is about 10%. So the BRCA1 gene clearly is a very important factor. But there are women who have the BRCA1 variant that don't develop breast cancer. Occupation. Dr. Kalman, in his introduction, mentioned that our Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences, we recognize and have recognized for centuries that there are things in the workplace, chemicals in particular, and things like asbestos, that can contribute to cancer risk. And if you look at the numbers, today, NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, estimates that there are about 20,000 cases of cancer every year in the United States that are largely attributable to occupation. And that number, if you go back to my 500,000 deaths per year, that works out to about 4% or so. There's some variability, and it depends on who you read, you know, what these numbers might actually be, but 4% is a reasonable estimate. Some people think it's not that much, other people think it's a bit more, but that's probably a reasonable guess. Well, what is it about the occupation? Well, there are lots of chemicals in our environment, in the workplace environment. Hopefully, and I haven't actually seen statistics on this, but hopefully we're seeing the occupationally related cancer deaths, the trend of that should be going down because we've identified many of those risks and we've taken actions to reduce exposures to these things. So we don't see a lot of asbestos exposure today. Unfortunately, there are still people developing both asbestosis and mesothelioma, a form of cancer from asbestos, from exposures that they had 40 or 50 years ago. So we're still seeing the effects of occupational exposures that occurred many years ago. But certainly with better identification of these hazards and reductions, we'll see a decrease in the contribution of occupation to overall cancer mortality in the coming decades. Geophysical factors, I already mentioned a little bit about radon. If one were to put into this, and I didn't adhere by my own advice here, I'm not even specifying where we're talking about mortality or incidence here. Largely, these are based on mortality. This would change if we were talking just about incidence because of how common skin cancer is from ultraviolet light. That might be considered certainly a physical factor. Alcohol, we know, is a contributor to some types of cancer. It contributes to liver cancer risk. It contributes to oral cancers. And it contributes a little bit to breast cancer risk, as you'll see in a moment. Pollution, we hear a lot about pollution. It's really a hard number to get a handle on. I think most scientists think that the one important thing about pollution is that it is something that we ought to be able to control. And so there's been a lot of emphasis on identifying pollutants in our environment that might cause cancer and trying to take measures to get rid of these. And while 2% sounds like a small contribution, if you think about 2% of 500,000, it's not a trivial number. So even 2% is not, I'm not putting that up there to say we shouldn't worry about those things, especially if they're preventable and you can identify the causes. But it's a real hard number to get a handle on. Some medicines, in the very act of using medicines to treat disease, can cause cancer. In fact, the vast majority of chemicals that are used to treat cancer, so-called chemotherapeutic agents, are themselves very potent cancer-causing chemicals. And we see, especially in children, what's sometimes referred to as secondary cancers. You'll see cancers develop later in life that were due to the treatments. Now, if the example of latency that I talked about earlier exists, if you don't see those cancers develop for 20, 30 years, and you're being treated for cancer when you're 55 or 60, that's a pretty good trade-off. You know, I would certainly take that treatment to live 25 or 30 more years to get cancer later on from that treatment. But it's something that we're very aware of, and there's a lot of effort to identify new treatment procedures for cancer that don't have associated with it increased risk of cancer in future years. Last couple of categories, industrial products, that's kind of, you might lump that up there with pollution. Again, very difficult to get a handle on what those numbers really are. And the last one I put on there from sort of a historical perspective. I recall in my younger days a lot of concern about food additives as being potentially cancer-causing. Many of you will remember when red dye number 2 was banned, and when cyclamates were banned, and when saccharin was almost banned, because there was the thought that a lot of these chemicals cause cancer. And the evidence today suggests that the food additives probably are not a contributing factor. And if you look at that bottom number there, I don't know if you can see that in the back, but it actually says a -5 to 2. Okay, well, there's actually a fair amount of evidence, at least in laboratory animals, that certain food preservatives may lower your risk of cancer. So what are food preservatives? Well, they're antioxidants. We put chemicals in foods, like Twinkies, okay? You put these chemicals so that the fats in the Twinkie don't oxidize and turn rancid. But those very same chemicals act as antioxidants in your body, and we now know that the whole process of what scientists call oxidative stress is probably a major contributor to cancer over many years. And so there's a lot of interest, in one of the roles of diet is to increase the antioxidants in your body. And so, again, some of the synthetic chemicals actually function that way, as well, of course, as many natural antioxidants like vitamin C and vitamin E. So let's take a look now, and I'll step back to the reproductive and sexual behavior risk and talk a little bit about breast cancer. And I find this really quite a fascinating website. You can go onto this website. There's a couple of different ones that you can find on the web. But there is so much data. There are so many relatively strong scientific studies. They all have their problems. They're not perfect, but there's a lot of data that back up some statistical models that one can use to sort of calculate theoretical breast cancer risk for an individual, for a woman. And if you pick a woman, and first of all, the most important risk factor for breast cancer is being female, okay? So being female puts you on this chart right here at about a lifetime risk of around 5%. If you were a female that had every other positive variable so that you were at the lowest risk. And some of those variables include things, for example, the age at which you have your first child. This is one of the strongest risk factors for breast cancer, aside from being female. For reasons that are not well understood, women who have their first child at an age younger than 19 or 20 are substantially lower risk for developing breast cancer in their lifetime than women who have their first child later in life. And this shows a middle risk for somebody who has their first child between the ages of 25 and 30. If a woman waits until after the age of 35 or 30 to 35, that risk is even about double that, about another 3%. So the age at which a woman has her first child is a very important, basically social factor that determines risk. And it's an important risk for an individual, but if you think societally, as you see changes in reproductive behavior, and we see that today, of women putting off the age that they have their first child for careers, et cetera, it wouldn't be surprising to see that show up in statistics. And there are many people that believe that some of the increase that we're seeing in breast cancer is due to factors such as that. The number of children a woman has some effect as well, not as dramatic as this. Other example of this, the age at which a young girl starts menstruating. The earlier, the higher the risk. The later, the lower the risk. Not a huge addition, around at 1% or so addition, but a significant risk nonetheless. It's fairly well recognized, and you can't read that. It says alcohol. It's just a little bar there. 1 drink a day is associated with a measurable, small but measurable increase in risk of breast cancer. Now, it's associated with a decreased risk of cardiovascular disease, okay? So, you kind of have to pick your poison, I guess, in terms of how you weigh these risk trade-offs. And in fact, that's what you will see with a lot of examples. There will be something that increases one risk for something and decreases a risk for something else. Hormone replacement therapy is a good example of that we can perhaps talk about a little bit later. Now, there are a number of other risk factors. It's now becoming recognized that obesity and inactivity or lack of exercise probably contribute to breast cancer risk, not as dramatically perhaps as some other types of cancer such as colorectal cancer, but may be important as well. And so this just gives you an idea of the kinds of factors that one can look at that are basically lifestyle factors. Now, interestingly, there's a lot of controversy about the role of diet in breast cancer risk. Early studies suggested that if you looked across the world and you looked at the fat intake, that there was this remarkable correlation that countries that had low intake of saturated fats and red meat had a much lower breast cancer risk than countries like the United States and developed countries that had a high intake of saturated fat and red meat. But studies in the United States, very well-designed studies, looking at the fat content within the range of typical of a U.S. diet, really don't find much of an association between fat intake and breast cancer risk. Again, there's some controversy there, but it's not the way that people expected to see that turn out. Well, a couple of other examples of types of risk factors oftentimes related to diet. Prostate cancer. Okay? The incidence of prostate cancer is very high. The mortality is fortunately much lower than the incidence, but it's still quite significant, as you saw earlier. So anything that we can identify that increases or lowers our risk of prostate cancer is going to be useful. And there's a lot of studies going on in populations trying to identify things. These are possible ones, and the data for these are controversial. There's not been a lot of repeated studies, but these are things that people are looking at now. Zinc might be important at high doses. There's not a lot of data on it, but it's popped up a few times. In contrast to what I said about breast cancer, there are some data that suggest that the diet's high in saturated fats and grilled meats, and there are certain chemicals that are formed as you cook meats called heterocyclic amines. They're not formed from contaminants in the meat, they're formed from the amino acids in the meat, and they happen when you grill them, when you cook it over high heat, are very potent mutagenic compounds, and things that cause mutations are thought to also increase chances of cancer. So there are things associated with diet and red meat and cooking, of how it's cooked, that may contribute to prostate cancer risk. There's a lot of interest recently about the role of vitamin D. And vitamin D you get from your diet, but it's really made active by sunlight. And so here's another example of you don't want to be too protective of sunlight. You want to avoid too much sunlight because you don't want to get skin cancer. But there's some concern that the emphasis to avoid exposures to sunlight for skin cancer could in fact lead to decreases in vitamin D, which is turning out to potentially be an important risk factor for some types of cancer, including prostate cancer. And inflammatory aspects are being shown in a lot of different kinds of studies with different kinds of cancers. Things that cause inflammation generate tissue damage that itself seems to perhaps increase the development of cancers. So if there are risk factors, there are also protective factors. And for prostate cancer, a lot of interest, I'm sure many of you have heard of this, about the red color in tomatoes is a carotenoid called lycopene. And you can go into the health food store and buy concentrated tablets of lycopene, and it will say for prostate health or something like that. In fact, there is some reasonably good evidence that diets high in certainly fruits and vegetables, and in particular tomatoes and that contain lycopene, do seem to be protective against prostate cancer risk. Cruciferous vegetables, there are a lot of chemicals present in broccoli and Brussels sprouts. Some of them are the ones that give them their unique flavor that some people like and others don't. These are remarkable chemicals. They're very biologically active. I do some of my own researches in this area. And they do amazing things to cells. And most of those things appear to be good, although some of them may not be good as well. But there are a lot of studies that have shown that diets high in cruciferous vegetables in particular seem to lower cancer risk for a variety of types of cancer, including prostate cancer. Other antioxidants, such as vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids that you find in fish oil, good for your heart, as well as perhaps lowering your cancer risk. Flavonoids, so-called isoflavones, that you find in soy. A lot of interest in this for breast cancer, but also perhaps prostate cancer risk. And one of the kinds of cancer, prostate cancer, as well especially as colon cancer, physical activity seems to be very important. So if we look at colon cancer risk, again, some factors such as a Western diet. Okay, well, what's that? Well, a Western diet tends to have a lot of fat in it, has red meat in it, tends not to have a lot of fruits and vegetables in it, and not a lot of fiber. And so that's what's classified as a Western diet. And that seems to be a major risk factor for colon cancer, and that's been shown really in study after study. Now, you flip that around, and there are obviously protective factors then. So you change your diet a little bit, okay? So you eat more fruits and vegetables, you eat more whole grain cereals that have fiber, et cetera. That may lower your cancer risk. Obesity is a major risk factor for colon cancer. And exercise itself seems to be important, and maybe it's important because it reduces obesity. There's probably a link there as well, obviously. Interestingly, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, so-called NSAIDs, have been shown in quite a few studies to lower colorectal cancer risk. And this was a really big, hot item when they were doing studies with celecoxib, Vioxx, okay, the drug that causes heart problems. So there was a great deal of interest in taking these NSAIDs, these so-called NSAIDs, to lower colon cancer risk and to have other beneficial anti-inflammatory responses, but the very rare occurrence, but significant occurrence of heart attacks in people taking these has kind of put a damper on further studies along those lines, at least for now. Folic acid and vitamin D, important dietary components as well, seem to be protective against colon cancer risk. And another example of a risk trade-off, hormone replacement therapy. You may recall in 2002 there was a very large study that was done looking at hormone replacement therapy in postmenopausal women taking estrogen and progestin, the combination pill. And these were women who had not had hysterectomies. And they stopped the study about 3 years short of its completion because they saw an elevation in breast cancer risk in this population. But they saw a substantial decrease in colorectal cancer risk and a decrease in bone fractures, which was one of the things that they were looking at in the study. So again, you have this risk trade-off. Now, just last week, there was another study, same Women's Health Initiative, another study that came out that said that hormone replacement therapy doesn't increase the risk of breast cancer. But it's not the same population, and it's important to understand that. The latest study was in women who had had hysterectomies and were taking estrogen-only replacement therapy. So it was ERT and not, so it was really different than the earlier one, and a lot of people said they contradicted each other. And they don't. They simply show that there are different formulations have different risks in different populations. But this was good news because a lot of women who have had hysterectomies are taking estrogen-only replacement therapy, and that does not seem to be associated with increased breast cancer risk. Okay, well, we're going to talk for just a few minutes about some chemicals that cause cancer, and this is in the world of pollutants as well as natural substances. There are some chemicals that are very potent cancer-causing chemicals. For example, I've spent a lot of my career studying a chemical that's produced by a mold that grows on corn and peanuts called aflatoxin. Aflatoxin is an exceedingly potent cancer-causing agent in laboratory rats. If you feed 15 parts per billion, and a part per billion is a very small amount, you feed 15 parts per billion in the diet to rats, 100% of the rats got liver cancer. And normally they don't get liver cancer. The current FDA allowable level of aflatoxin in corn and peanut products in the United States is 15 parts per billion. Now that doesn't sound like there's a big protective factor there, but in fact there are species differences. If you feed 150,000 parts per billion to laboratory mice, they don't get liver cancer. Now, humans are somewhere on that scale, and I've done a lot of work myself in looking at why that's the case. But what we know is, in the United States, it doesn't seem to be an important public health problem. That's because the FDA does a really good job of keeping this stuff out of our food supply. In regions in China, in Central Africa, and Asia, where there's high heat and humidity that promote the mold growth, people grow their own corn and sometimes peanuts, and they're a staple of their diet. They put them in a bin, and they eat out of that bin for the next 11 months until the next year's crop is done. By the time they get down, it's pretty moldy. And it has a lot of aflatoxin in it, and they eat it. And in some regions in China, liver cancer is the leading cause of death in males between the ages of 35 and 50. So it's a very important risk factor there. And it's complicated by the fact that those same populations have a lot of hepatitis B virus, which causes liver cancer. And there's been a number of studies that have shown that the two together are much worse than either one alone. So there's a synergism there. And for that reason, we have it in our diet. It's at low levels in the United States. We are exposed to it. But it doesn't really appear to be an important public health problem in this country and in most developed countries. There are a lot of chemicals that are formed as you cook foods that are naturally occurring, and they're combustion products, basically. So when you grill that steak on the grill, some of that good flavorful stuff actually has cancer-causing chemicals in it if you feed a lot of it to laboratory animals. And that may contribute to some extent to colorectal cancer risk in the United States and perhaps other types of cancer. Of course, a lot of attention has been given to synthetic chemicals, man-made chemicals in our diet, including pesticides. Most of those that cause cancer have been banned, although there's still concerns floating about these residues, and things like very stable persistent chemicals like dioxins and PCBs. Most studies have not found an association with sort of the background levels that we have and, for example, breast cancer risk, although there continues to be concern about that. Well, if we look at where we are exposed to chemicals in our environment, of course, there are things in the air, in the workplace environment, such as asbestos and benzene that we've identified. These are clearly human carcinogens, and we've done a lot to lower exposures to these. We're all exposed to benzene at low levels. It's still present in gasoline, although at very, very low levels compared to what it used to be. There are lots of things in our drinking water. Arsenic is a common natural contaminant of groundwater. The EPA changed their level of arsenic, allowable arsenic in drinking water. And the very process of disinfecting water with the chlorination process introduces chemicals, so-called disinfection byproducts, that are like chloroform and a couple of other chemicals at very low levels that at high doses cause cancer in laboratory animals. Whether they really are important risk factors for humans exposed at the level that appears in the normal drinking water remains to be argued. With all of these, there's as a toxicologist, I have to put in a plug for a very fundamental rule of thumb, and that is the dose makes the poison. There are lots of things in our environment that if you test in very large levels in laboratory animals will give those animals cancer, and we need to be concerned about them. But we need also to put it in perspective and look at the dose that we're getting in our diet and do things to lower them, but again, use some reasonable precautions on that. So just a couple of closing comments here that I will address briefly sort of as a summary. We know that genetics are important. We know that family history is important, for example, with breast cancer and colorectal cancer. Genetics alone doesn't account for a whole lot. We know from studies of looking at migrant populations across the world that environment plays a very important role, and by environment I'm including things like diet, lifestyle factors such as alcohol and smoking, etc. And those are very important. Now, what we know about the causes of cancer, and I'm going to do a very simple overview, a 1-minute overview here about why all of these lifestyle factors and why chemicals in our environment and things in our diet probably make a lot of difference. And it has to do with an interaction between our genetics and our environment. A colleague of mine at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences used to say, genes load the gun, the environment pulls the trigger. And what we're talking now is how are we going to go from the DNA in a cell to human populations in looking at how genes and environment interact to make a normal cell go bad. And there are a couple of very basic processes involved in this. And the first is that we have something on the order of 13 trillion cells in our body, and each cell has a complete complement of our DNA. If that DNA in a cell is mutated in just the right place, and there are about 25,000 or so different genes that DNA is packaged into. And you can envision each gene as having a set of switches. And that gene is turned on in some cells and it's not turned on in other cells. Some genes are turned on at birth and then they're turned off, etc. And if you have a gene that's controlling the rate at which a cell divides, and it's normally turned off or not expressed very much, then those cells aren't going to grow very rapidly. But if you mutate that, you turn the switch on, and that gene now starts sending signals to the cells. As they start dividing, you have what's sometimes referred to as an initiating event, and you generate a cell that is precancerous. It's kind of like driving your car down the street and having the accelerator stick. Okay, not a good thing. Okay, but fortunately, you have a variety of other things. You have a set of brakes, hopefully, that are going to be able to control you for a while anyhow. And so initiated cells by themselves may sit around for a long time in the body and slowly expand and pass on that mutation to their daughter cells. And then one of those cells will acquire another mutation. And if that second mutation happens to be in another gene that is putting on the brakes of these cells, okay? So now you've got the accelerator stuck, and all of a sudden you've lost your brakes. Now you've got a serious problem. And the problem is there are hundreds of different genes that act as accelerators and as brakes. And any combination of those potentially could lead to a cell that has lost its ability to control its own growth. And so that cell then rapidly grows and becomes a dominant population. And those cells now acquire additional mutations. And one of the characteristics of these cells is their DNA is unstable to begin with, so it's really easy to get mutations in these cells now. And they then send on other signals that allow these cells to break off and get in your bloodstream and get in to your lymphatics and move throughout your body. And that's the process that we know of cancer. So understanding the molecular biology of this process is going to be critical in terms of looking at what the future holds for us. Will there be a cure for cancer? Well, there won't be a single cure for cancer because cancer isn't a single disease. Hopefully there will be many cures. I think that these new tools of genomics that we have will be very important in helping us to understand exactly the steps that I've just shown you to develop new drugs and approaches both for early diagnosis and for treatment that will go a long ways towards controlling and maybe finally making some progress in this very long war against cancer. So better tools for earlier diagnosis should lead to better treatments for disease. And of course, the best thing that you can do, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The more we understand about risk factors that we can control and lower, the better off that we will be. So diet, lifestyle factors, not smoking, obvious things like that, obviously can make a very important contribution. So with that, I'm going to close. I put some acknowledgments up here. I thank all of you for your attention. I'd like to thank the Department of Environmental Health and the School of Public Health at the University of Washington. It's been my home for 27 years here. The sponsors of this program, all of the people in my lab that have helped me succeed over the years. Thank you.